Random House Audio presents The End and the Beginning by George Weigel. Read for you by Stefan Rudnicki. Prologue. The Millennial Pope. As March gave way to April in the spring of 2005, and the world kept vigil outside the apostolic palace in Rome, the pontificate of Pope John Paul II, then drawing to a poignant end, was already being described as one of the most consequential in 2 millennia of Christian history. 8 months after his election to the papacy on October 16, 1978, John Paul had ignited a revolution of conscience in his native Poland, a moral challenge to the Cold War status quo that helped set in motion the international drama that would culminate in the collapse of European communism in 1989 and the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991. The millennial pope's impact on the world was not limited to his native region, however. Over the first 2 decades of the pontificate, John Paul also played important roles in democratic transitions in venues ranging from Central and South America to East Asia, even as he established himself as a universal moral witness to the dignity of the human person and the world's principal exponent of the universality of human rights. As he neared the end of his earthly pilgrimage, John Paul II, of whom the world knew very little at the beginning of his papacy, had become the singular embodiment of the trials, tragedies, and triumphs of the second half of the 20th century for billions of human beings. His impact on the Catholic Church had been just as dramatic as his influence on world affairs. Over 2.5 decades, he had reinvigorated the Church, spiritually and intellectually, restoring a sense of the adventure of discipleship for many Catholics, and constantly reminding the entire Church that it did not exist for its own sake, but for its evangelical mission, to proclaim the gospel of God's saving love for humanity throughout the world. Vigorously deploying the tools of the modern communications and transportation revolutions, John Paul II had given new meaning to the papal title Universal Pastor of the Church, bringing the ministry of the Bishop of Rome to the Church in a series of papal pilgrimages inside Italy and around the globe that was unprecedented in history. One of the signature events of those travels, itself an astonishment to many, were World Youth Days, in which the Pope confounded the expectations of both secure secularists and insecure churchmen by demonstrating that young people from the developed world, the formerly communist world, and the developing world all responded enthusiastically to his forthright challenge to live lives of heroic virtue. Equally surprising to some had been John Paul II's robust commitment to the quest for Christian unity, his determination to forge a new relationship between Catholicism and Judaism, his investment in inter-religious dialogue with the increasingly restive worlds of Islam, and his interest in building bridges between religious faith and science. At the same time as he was giving new meaning to the traditional papal title of pontiff, which derives from the Latin word for bridge, and even as he was reinventing the papacy as an office of evangelical witness rather than bureaucratic management, John Paul II was creating the most intellectually consequential body of papal teaching in centuries, calling the Catholic Church to deepen its commitment to its doctrinal and moral traditions, while engaging modernity's critique of revealed religion and classic morality. Perhaps most strikingly, John Paul had proposed a fresh reading of Catholicism's sexual ethic, in which faithful and fruitful marital love was understood as an icon of the interior life of the Holy Trinity. In his intellectual method, putting classic truths of faith and morals into rigorous dialogue with contemporary understandings of the human person, as in other facets of his pontificate, John Paul II had been a sign of contradiction as well as a witness to hope, as he described himself at the United Nations in 1995. Revered by hundreds of millions of people, many of them neither Catholic nor Christian, he had been sharply criticized by many Catholic intellectuals and activists throughout his papacy, which his critics, who included priests, religious sisters, and bishops, deemed one of restoration, an abandonment of the commitments the Catholic Church had undertaken at the Second Vatican Council, held from 1962 through 1965. A champion of freedom, who had done as much as anyone to liberate his Slavic brethren from the totalitarian yoke, he was resented by some for his insistence that freedom is not a neutral faculty of choice, and that freedom rightly lived is always freedom tethered to moral truth and ordered to goodness. A genuine intellectual, with a profound reverence for the life of the mind, he was accused by some of being an opponent of academic freedom. A pastor with more than 5 decades of experience in helping men and women grapple with the ambiguities and temptations of the human condition, he was not infrequently charged with being insensitive and authoritarian. Yet even his critics had to concede that he had become a global moral reference point, a man whose thought mattered even to those who opposed it and opposed the church he led. How had he come to this point? What were the influences that had formed this unique and striking personality? A man who, while thoroughly grounded in a particular faith, had come to exercise a kind of universal fatherhood that touched hearts, minds, and souls across the spectrum of human experience and conviction. The story of the pre-papal life of Karol Wojtyła and the first 22 years of his papacy is told in Witness to Hope, the biography of Pope John Paul II, to which this volume is both complement and sequel. In the years since that book's publication, information has become available that sheds new light on the drama of Karol Wojtyła's 40-year struggle against communism, and communism's 40-year effort to impede Wojtyła's work and destroy his reputation. It is a striking tale, for Poland's communist authorities, their masters in Moscow, and their allies throughout the Soviet bloc long regarded Karol Wojtyła as a mortal enemy, and after his election as pope, as a mortal threat to the communist position in Central and Eastern Europe, to the communist project throughout the Third World, and indeed to the very survival of communism itself. In these judgments they were not mistaken, although they were often wrong in their conception of Wojtyła's strategy and in their reading of his mind. Vast human and financial resources were expended in the communist war against Karol Wojtyła, and after his election as pope, against the church he led. Those efforts ultimately proved futile, for the weapons Wojtyła deployed were weapons whose impact communist tactics could not blunt. Yet the communists tried hard to destroy his work and his authority, first in Krakow, later when he came to Rome. Many remain convinced that these efforts included the assassination attempt of May 13, 1981. In any event, the war against Wojtyła included an extensive campaign to suborn, blackmail, and recruit as informants his associates in Poland and in Rome. These clandestine enterprises were frequently coordinated by the intelligence agencies of the Soviet bloc, with all the information gathered by Warsaw Pact intelligence services shared with the KGB in Moscow, where copied records of these operations likely remain, and remain closed to scholars. Many records of the communist war against Karol Wojtyła and against Pope John Paul II were destroyed during and immediately after the communist crack-up in 1989. But a vast archive that had only begun to be explored in the first half-decade after John Paul's death remained. Careful analysis of even a modest selection of these primary source materials, all of which were originally classified and some of which were considered so sensitive that they were only available to the most senior Communist Party and Communist secret police officials, yields a much richer and more detailed portrait of how and why communism went to war against Karol Wojtyła, when he was Archbishop of Krakow and after he became Bishop of Rome. These materials also illustrate how communist governments and secret intelligence services penetrated the Vatican and sought to use diplomatic contacts with the Holy See as means to advance their interests, which could have been expected, and to strengthen their efforts to penetrate the highest levels of Catholic leadership, particularly in the Vatican itself, a process to which many senior Vatican officials seemed largely oblivious. The records of the KGB, the Polish Służba Bezpieczeństwa, or SB, and the East German Stasi.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?